I would like to invite our keynote speaker, Steven Sinofsky.
I'm in trouble now.
You can pick your seat.
And I have to. Is this okay? This one? Is that
Perfect.
Sure. Okay, first, I just have to mention I didn't get any of the speaker training or anything. So now,
He's too good for that.
and this has to really count. There was all these expectations and then the no training, so I'm a little worried.
So, Steven, welcome. I'm pulling up my questions for you right now, and maybe you can. Everybody knows you, but maybe you can share with us like what you think makes a great product and what makes a great product leader.
Sure. That's a big, wide open question at the beginning, and I should have brought PowerPoint up for that. But the first thing that always occurs to me for a great product is I'm gonna tilt myself towards the business or enterprise world. I do think that they're very different answers for both of them. But in the enterprise world, the thing that has always resonated with me for being a great product is a product that becomes somebody's job, and where it moves from like a way they can do their work to the reason that they come into work in the morning and the thing that they do. And whether, I worked for a long time on Office at Microsoft, and always think about, the very first time I did a customer visit to learn about spreadsheets and people using them. And I'd already used spreadsheets, but was just a kid. And then when I first saw them at a bank, I remember the bankers looking at me going, yeah, it's very cute that you guys out in Seattle make spreadsheets, but we here make more money from Excel than you do.
So you
think about it for a minute, and like at first you're like, what are you talking about? And then you start to think about it, and you're like, oh, that's actually true. And then the same thing would happen when you go visit McKinsey and you talk about PowerPoint, and forgetting that their slides are incomprehensible and all that stuff. But and so for me, it always is how that and like a really great example that might represent some of the work of the people in the room right now is Salesforce. And how it took a job function that had been underserved by software, and now like any of you that are founding team people trying to hire salespeople, now the salespeople who used to say, I don't use software, this is a relationship business, I talk to people, I use a phone, they won't join your company if you're not either willing to set up Salesforce or you're already set up on Salesforce. And so there's that inversion that takes place. And so for me, that's like one of the sort of key measures that you look for in is your product really breaking through with people?
So you're saying, is a product creating a whole new industry or set of industries, right? Like banking and consulting and a lot of other things.
Or even or even at a smaller level where it comes to define a person's job. Mm-hmm. And it could be a very task-focused product, or it could be a product like Photoshop, or where the job becomes that, and the software becomes the job, and you're never really sure.
And then at some point, if you don't know how to use that software or that product, you're out of a job, right?
Yeah, or you start to see, like the real test is when you start to see it show up on LinkedIn profiles. Like, I have the skill to use this. And I remember, just because I tell old stories a lot, but like when you first started to see people writing Microsoft Office on their resumes, now of course you don't, because you assume that they are human and they can use it. But there was that time when all of a sudden it became like an interview question. And then like, can you do bullets and numbering? How about, fonts and formulas?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what's a great product leader then who can build something like this?
That's a much deeper question. And it's actually very interesting. It's sort of one of my bigger learnings coming from the Microsoft bubble world to the Silicon Valley bubble world was in the bubble transport machine apparatus. A lot of things like definitions just change. And so a product leader at Microsoft, which I know for sure some of you in the room have done that before, is very different than a product leader in the Valley. And I kind of look to the Microsoft one and I keep having to remind myself, well, it turns out we kind of took the lead in inventing it for software, because the product leaders in the Valley, or in the early days, were really these sort of project manager, hardware, taskmaster kind of people. Are we getting? And so, wow, I feel now I have stature. And so what happened is the history of product management, which at Microsoft is called program management, just to confuse everybody, it was that we had all of these engineers writing a bunch of code, and this is literally creating Excel, the very first one for the Mac. And it turns out it's wildly inefficient to create the code if you don't know what you're doing. Go figure. And so one of the people that was on the marketing team, like the actual takeout ads, demand generation marketing team, had this idea that like maybe what we should do is spend a little bit of energy before we write the code to figure out what code we should write. Again, just a huge breakthrough. And what happened was that was sort of the creation of this program management discipline. But the reason was very much rooted in this engineering first ethos that like the most precious thing in the team is the engineer's resource and time and efficiency. And so therefore, the role of program management was to bring efficiency to basically not rewrite the same code over and over again. And so I grew up with this notion that a product leader was a person whose goal is to make engineering as efficient as possible. Mm-hmm. And I just have that sort of, like servant view of the role. And we always viewed it as these legs of a triangle, which was engineering, or what we call development, and testing, and product management, and program management. And they were all three necessary and peers in the relationship. The Valley, and organizationally, they were literally peers, like they didn't report to each other. The Valley grew up with sort of this different thing, which Ben Horowitz refers to in his book as, sort of CEO of the product, which actually sounds like way cooler than servant of the team. But it's a very different, and I never really warmed up to that because I found so much value in this peer relationship, like a checks and balances. Because whenever you try to have one person in charge of something, it becomes either a bottleneck or you're subject to the arbitrary nature of that person's thought or opinion. Whereas consensus brings a very strong sense of things, especially when it's not consensus between like three product managers with an opinion. It's a consensus between the ability to make something, the ability to assure its quality, and the design of the thing. And that's a very big, important balance. And so for me, the people who make the best product leaders are the ones that see themselves in this role of not making sure that the best ideas, or not making sure that they have the best ideas, but making sure that the best ideas happen, making sure that everybody's voice is heard, and making sure that the balance of power is maintained throughout the development of a product.
Mm-hmm. And so everyone we have handpicked here has been working as a product manager for a long time, and now has become a product leader, so a leader of product managers. So how do you lead teams that are always on the look for efficiency and cutting towards the critical path?
Well, everybody has their own style of leadership, and you have to always sort of, do you want to conflate the role of managing the team versus leading the team, and what the right balance there is? And it certainly depends on scale and complexity. How many dimensions does your product have? Are you very heavy into both user interface and platform? Do you have a big consumer flow that you have to optimize? Like that sort of begins to define your leadership span, which really what it's defining is your level of abstraction and how much are you responsible personally for the choices that are being made versus responsible personally for building a framework for the choices that are being made. And so for me, the best leaders in product have always been the people that were most able to create a decision-making framework that sort of self-actualizes and operationalizes itself. So that, there was an old saying a very long time ago that you could always tell the product managers at Microsoft because they always had a really big line out in front of their office door. And I always thought that was literally the dumbest thing I ever heard. Like and I thought that's like a testosterone way to look at a problem. Like if you have a really big line, then you're important. But of course, that just means all those people in line are not doing anything but waiting. And it means you're reacting to stuff on the fly and you're making up like answers to unblock the line and keep it moving. And so the real measure for me is like the number of times that the product leader doesn't have a line in front of their, and I said door because we all had offices at Microsoft, if that confused you, what that meant. Not outside the building, which is probably what you all thought. And so this idea that like your job is to avoid the creation of bottleneck and to help people know like what the overall framework is for success in deciding things.
So you empower people, you create a culture where everyone can make their own decision so that you have nobody by your door.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, those are easy words to say, not to pick on them, but another way to say it is you're sort of creating this bounding box that defines success for the product. You know, like how much time you're going to work on it, how many resources you have for engineering, where you want like success to be measured in terms of usage or revenue or clicks or ease of use. And you put enough constraints that you allow people to move forward, but not so many that you don't need a human being involved in the process. And that's really a notion of scale, like how granular to make that. And it takes a lot of iteration and building the team up before it's really two things. One, you're comfortable not diving in and solving all the problems, and people feel empowered and comfortable working within, you've made the right size bounding box.
And you're right, like that's not an easy thing to do. Do you have maybe an example you want to share with us of a time or maybe a progression from creating that team to then empowering them and then realizing that they're operating like without too much guidance from you?
Sure. Well, I have lots, like, unfortunately. So what I like to do when asked that is I like to pick like super old examples, because then nobody has any, that's a thing I learned at teaching at Harvard Business School, which was like you use really old examples, and even though you can go Google the answer for like how it ended up, you have to really dive in to see the lesson, because just knowing the answer like doesn't really help. And so one of the things we did the very first time we tried to put like a bounding box around a whole suite of products was when we made Office 97. Like, so that's before most of you were born. So that qualifies as super old. But like one of the things we set out to do was architecturally we wanted to share a bunch of code. And so imagine you have hundreds of engineers, actually literally like 200 total, and they're supposed to, you tell them share code. And the very first iteration was like, that's just not enough of a bounding box, because first, developers don't like to share code to begin with, so that's just super hard. And then when they decide to share code, they don't have an innate process for defining the abstraction layers and the interfaces and the bounds between that. And if you talk about sharing code for user experience or user interface, there's absolutely a complete resistance to doing that. And so when we started, we didn't have we thought it was good enough to tell people, well, sharing code is good, like everybody agrees. And then it went haywire. So what we did is we literally
Give us an example, like haywire. You say like what does that mean?
Well, what it meant was like there was no sharing code, like because like in the absence of any requirement or firing somebody for not sharing code, empowerment said the easiest path is to just not. And so we would have these like awesome conversations about like toolbars in client-side apps, and like the Excel team would go visit the bankers and they would do all of this research and they would come back with like a mathematical proof that toolbars should be 16 pixels high. And like you'd be like, that's the design, we did it, we've tested it, it's perfect. The Word team would go to Washington, D.C. and visit all these lawyers and come back after all these thousands of hours in labs with mathematical proof that toolbars should be 15 pixels high. And you're like, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. And I'm like, but it actually happened. Like literally we're sitting in a meeting and people are like at fisticuffs over 15 versus 16 pixels. Also color buttons, not color buttons, the color of the tip. And it was all like science, so you couldn't argue with it. And so then if we said, why don't we just have one piece of code for toolbars like our competitor does? And everybody's like, well, we can't. And if you're not going to fire us or take away our resources or anything else, we'll just keep going. And so then we shipped a release of Office with jaggedy toolbars. We couldn't like do a screenshot of the product because it was so obvious to anybody who cares about UI that which was the marketing people were like, no one's going to notice. I'm like, we all noticed. And so what we did is we sort of circled back.
But what's wrong with having a toolbar that's 16 pixel versus 15 pixel?
Good question. It turns out that even though marketing said no one was going to notice, what they were actually selling to customers was the notion of an integrated, consistent suite of products. Like that was the value proposition. And all the demos literally would show like the apps would like literally do these like jiggle movements when they would switch between Word and Excel because there was a pixel difference. And like it was literally like nails on a chalkboard when anyone skilled in the art would watch it. And they were convinced nobody would notice. And then, of course, all the reviewers noticed.
So the user feedback, the cross-functional alignment wasn't there.
Well, we thought sharing code was a good idea, and we didn't actually put in place any mechanism that rewarded it or penalized you for not doing it. And we didn't give anybody a real strategic rationale why it was a good use of resources to spend what it equates to extra energy to go talk to people down the hall. And then the reviews came out, and then all of a sudden, like, people started to realize maybe we should do something. Yeah. So then what we did is we just put this like bounding box, and so toolbars was only one example of code that we wanted to share. We had like 6 or 8 other things, but what we did is we put in place like this high order framework that said we're going to share toolbar code, we're going to share code for drawing, we're going to share code for this list of things. And then there was that degree of freedom got removed from the product making decision framework from everybody else. And then people were like, okay, now we know we're on the team that's supposed to do toolbars, which it sounds ridiculous to have this, but they were an invention. Like, they didn't exist and then they existed. So it's kind of cool that there was a whole team to do it at the time. Now it seems ridiculously wasteful to think that people were spending brain energy on this problem. But by having this bounding box, the innovation energy got focused at the right level of abstraction. And then you get as the output that higher order goal of sharing code.
So what I'm hearing is you said, we would like to share code, it's a good thing. Nobody did, bad user feedback, marketing misalignment, and then you say, well, see, like we told you, here's more data that's going to prove that now we need to actually share code. And then you use what, reorganization to make it happen?
It turns out sometimes you use reorgs and sometimes you don't. And that, like, reorgs is a very blunt instrument. Like, you generally get what you want, but you generally have a lot of other stuff you have to do. And for, depending on the size of your company, reorgs can also be meaningless. If you have 100 people, shuffling them around a little bit doesn't really change anything. And if you're a distributed team, the org is like completely secondary to the geography. So figuring out, but we did do the org change, but we were a very co-located, high volume team. So it made sense for us at the time.
I see. So that's a very great example of how you create a culture. Now, could this whole thing have been avoided with product reviews, and how do you recommend people conduct product reviews?
So although I didn't get the speaker coaching, I got to see this in advance, the question. And so my first reaction is I'm like literally the worst person in the world to ask about product reviews because I never did them. And I have this whole long history. In fact, in this book that I wrote, there's like a whole thing about reviews and a whole chapter that goes into it because Microsoft wasn't, or isn't even, it's not one company, it's like several under one brand, and they work very, very differently. And one of the things that worked completely differently between the Office-y people and the Windows-y people were these reviews. And actually, Mike is here somewhere, isn't he? Oh, there. So Mike Maples is here, and I worked for Mike's dad. And so Mike's dad was like the head of all of Office and the best manager ever in the history of managers. And he was the one who instilled in the Office culture back in the late 80s this notion that you don't really do reviews because like all it does is it sort of disempowers people in a progressively bad way. Like the first time they come in and then you do a review and then they change everything based on your like last second quick feedback. And then the next time they're like, well, we don't really want to change everything, so let's just kind of come in sort of semi-half-baked and then we'll figure out what to do. And by the third time they're coming in just saying, why don't you just tell us what to do and then we'll do it. And then you realize the boss is now trying to make up the whole plan on the fly. And if you're in the wrong mindset or motivated, like the boss is like motivated by ego or thinks they know, they fall into the trap of just enabling this sort of spiral. And that was what I had observed for a long time on the Windows team. And they were very review driven. And this notion of review is we have a very hard problem or we're supposed to do something with that group, so we need to have a big meeting and fix it. And like that it never resolved it. Like you can't ever fix a hard problem in an hour. Mm-hmm. Like we're all into that now because President Obama has reminded everybody that every decision that comes to him like is actually the ones that can't be solved. And so that review mindset is you don't really want to have it. And so the idea, what I used to do instead was really focus on, we have this bounding box, and so what we really want to do is at defined intervals, you just get to show up and say, we told you at n-1 we were going to do these things. We're now at n, and this is what we've gotten done, and this is what we're going to do at n+1. And then you just repeat that, whether it's every month, because it's a 12-month project, or every quarter, if it's a 2-year project, or whatever time interval works, and I've scaled it across all of those. And that's the best way to keep management informed. And so rather than the management reviewing the work, it's you, the team, announcing to management how you're doing. And there's never an ask in that process. There's never a realignment that happens. It's a self-awareness motion.
So it's like a bottom-up road mapping, right? You're asking all the teams to come up with what have they done, what should they be doing next?
It is, but you have to remember there was this framework at the beginning.
Okay,
so
that's
it's this combination of, we had a top-down framework, we had a middles out plan, because all the teams that have to spin next to each other, and then we had the bottom-up, the line items. And so we always used to say it's this combination of top-down, middle out, and bottom-up.
So that's my next question, which is around product strategy, right? There's like a small strategy, what's my team going to do next when I have maybe a few product managers, and then there's big strategy, which is how am I going to create these whole new industries. So how do you think about product strategy?
Well, I think that the way that I would tend to think about that is before you even start writing like one line of code or one spec or PRD or something, you have to just ask yourself, is what we're doing sustaining the business we're currently in, or trying to create some new business? Now, a startup, of course, is always trying to create a new business, but that actually lasts for a very short time, because the minute that customers are paying you, you now face the decision for everything you do. Are we expanding, or are we sustaining the flow we have? Even if it's getting new customers, you're still sustaining the sales motion, the value proposition, that motion that you've set up. And so there's just a very big difference in how you approach either of those. Because if it's sustaining, your process is very much based on the existing marketplace that you're part of, your competitors, how are you, where are you deficient, where are you losing deals, where are you winning deals, and just making this whole set of trade-offs over like the best place to spend your resources, knowing like what you're out there selling every day. And on the other hand, if you're building something new, you're going to go through an experimentation phase, and you're going to have to figure out. You can't have too much of a plan because you don't really know yet. But you also can't just have everybody spinning in a different cycle. So you're much more likely to benefit from a series of high-level prototypes that become increasingly high fidelity until you get to like, okay, this is what we're going to go build. And then you're just sort of, I don't want to just read the Lean Startup book while I'm up here, but that's essentially what you have to do.
So you're saying like, it sort of depends if you're in a hyper-growth phase, in which case like Lean Startup methodologies will apply, or if you're in a phase where you're saying, okay, now I'm going to stabilize and really milk my product, in which case it goes back to that idea of the framework that you described earlier.
I might also phrase it as though like in one scenario you have like a business. And your business can be a revenue-based measure of what you want to do. It can be a user growth, but you have an engine that's working. And so once you have an engine that's working, then you are sustaining it with what you're doing. And you might choose, we want to charge in a whole new way, in which case that's fine, but it's still built on this value proposition, you're paying differently. And then the other is like, no one's giving us anything. No one's visiting us, and no one is giving us money. So we can't just release, we have to develop a thesis for what we're doing, and that's a little bit more. And so whether it's hypergrowth is a goal, but it doesn't have to be where you are. It could just be you're at zero, trying to get to some repeatable something. Basically, it's in a venture sense, it's just the seed stage. And you could be at a big company at a seed stage, or you could be at a venture stage at a seed stage. But until you get to like, we have like 5 customers who are giving us money, or we have 1 million people who are using us every day.
Got it. Steven, I want to ask you one more question before we open it up. Hiring product managers is probably one of the hardest decisions and most impactful, and you hired hundreds of them. What are your tips, your recommendations?
I have to. Jackie was a college hire from Cornell that I like actually interviewed on campus. Like, I don't want to say how many long ago. It was a long time ago. Let's just say before her child and her whole other life in the Valley. There's no. I actually what I would like to do with that question is flip it around to something that I work with a lot in the startups that I work with. That is a thing that I think we all could work on, and you've done a great job with the representation of diversity in this group. But one of the things that I run up against a lot particularly in early stage companies is, the high order bit from the founders is culture fit. And I find myself reeling at that phrase because culture fit also reads like they have to be like everybody else. And it starts to look like, college Greek system rush, where you're driving for this homogeneity. And there are elements of culture that you could look for and fit, but that's like things that we think of always kind of want, like being civil, being able to state your opinion, working with other people. Mm-hmm. But far too often it sort of bleeds into, and they answer the question the way that I would answer. And for product people, it's especially dangerous to think about culture fit because often you're dealing with highly uncertain things and also you're reasoning under uncertain amounts of data. And so culture fit tends to be like, wow, you guessed it the same way I did, and we didn't know why. And then you've realized that the reason was because we both went to private high schools and Ivy League colleges and majored in computer science. So it's likely we're kind of all homogeneous, and that doesn't help your product at all, particularly when you're trying to build a team that's worldwide and in many languages and many cultures. And so for me, the most important thing about hiring is yeah, you need the base skills and all of that, but it's actually to avoid the most common pitfalls, which is having a team of people that all think exactly the same. So
in order to do that, you're saying find somebody who would do something very efficiently, solve problem efficiently, but not the way you would.
Well, like the most obvious one that we went through as a learning curve was for the longest time, interviews. So Google used to do these interviews. They copied us. We did them first. I have no idea who did them for us. I'm sure in my head we invented it. But this whole idea was you would have like these elaborate questions that had multiple parts and forks, and you would ask people to answer them. And then after a while, we started losing people to Google, but we also realized that actually asking a person to design a television remote control at a whiteboard on the fly when they've never thought about it before, there are plenty of people who just don't do that well. Which is not that they don't design things well. And there are plenty of people who actually can't work well with others or have no customer empathy, but could, happen to be able to bat out a TV remote control design on a whiteboard. And so you end up optimizing for this different thing. And what really changed that were allowing people to bring in portfolios, allowing people to think about the question before they showed up for the interview, allowing them to go Google stuff and find examples or use a tool other than a whiteboard. Even just the act of moving from the whiteboard to writing on paper on a desk, it decreases the stress level for some people by an order of magnitude because they don't feel they're doing performance art. They feel like they're working.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
So at our company, we have a couple of feature areas, and product managers work kind of separately. But one thing that we're trying to understand is how do you create high leverage so that when the product areas kind of complement each other, you get exponential value out of it. How did you solve that?
Well, the first order question for that, I hope everybody heard. Was that yes, no? What happens when you have multiple areas? Is it one product or multiple products?
It's one product.
Yeah. So it's one product with sort of multiple areas of responsibility, and you're trying to get some sort of 1 + 1 + 1 is greater than 3 kind of effort across that. And I think the first question is always, if that's a goal, then everybody has to be aware of that in their bounding box. Because absent that, people will always optimize locally. And that's just a very natural thing. The variable of other people to the left and right is very different than the people either below me or the engineers that I have to work with. And so for me, it is very similar to this code sharing question, whereas once you have in place this notion that like our product is made up of multiple things, but to be successful, they have to do something together. The bounding box, the plan needs to include like an example for people to understand of what you're aiming for together. But it's generally like that kind of synergy or that kind of amplification. It doesn't happen naturally, and it's not an org problem. It's just like you give a person a job to design X. X is going to consume them, and whatever resources. If you give them 6 people or 12 people or 2, all they're going to do is fill up their to-do list with X. If you say that part of X is that it has to work with Y at the very start, then you have a process in place to really do that.
One more question?
Well, having teams move from the sustaining mode that you mentioned to innovation mode, that happens all the time, right? Like, you're doing great, the revenue's looking good, what's next? So and you're leading a team, so how do you kind of bring your team into that mindset?
So the question is, you're doing well, you're in what sort of sustaining mode, and then you want to go into innovation mode. It's a very interesting question because the question is almost like it's very subtle. Like, what is innovation mode? Because it's really, is the innovation about sustaining the business? And sustaining sounds like a bad word, but it really means like, wow, we sold to 100 customers last year, and we'd like to sell to 1,000 customers this year, which is hyper growth by 10x. But it really is sustaining. Like and so I don't tend to use sustaining as a negative, a bad word, and innovation is the only positive word. You are doing new things, but you're doing them on this foundation that you've built. So what you're trying to do is accelerate the foundation. And so I think that there's not really a transition in that. The real transition is in fact, like what you see quite frequently is we're a company, we've built a sustainable product and a business, and now we want to build another product. And that's the super hard leap to make, because it's not necessarily innovation, but you're innovating the whole company. And you're likely to, like, especially in the enterprise world, it's almost certain that you're doing something that some customer or partner is already doing with your product. Like, you do this thing, and then you find out all your customers are integrating with something, and you go, well, that's going to be our next product. And that's not bad, and because it turns out by doing them together, you'll do a better job than maybe an integrated third-party solution would, or a custom solution, or you have a better idea for the whole. And so the mindset then is, like, it's actually very similar. You're like, your goal is to build a new product, but not to clone your competitor, but to add your secret sauce of, why are they coming from this one company rather than 2 separate companies?
Right. But how do you sort of, as a leader, how do you navigate the challenge of getting your team into that mindset? And as you're talking about this example that comes to my mind is like Google, when they went from search into mobile business, like they started a new product category altogether, right? And they are successful at both. So as a leader, how do you get your team there?
Yeah. So
or the company.
Sorry.
Steven, would you repeat the question?
I was about to. So it was just, there was a lot there, so I was mostly thinking how was I going to, but the question is, how do you transition the team in a mindset from one to another? And the example was, Google and search to Google and mobile. Google is very interesting because especially when you look at, say, the past 8 years or so, there was a lot of like, hey, let's just go do this. And the measures of success are very hard to find because it's not like they report out P&Ls on anything but advertising. So we don't really know how to measure that kind of thing, which is very different than say, even though they don't report the revenue numbers, like if Amazon spawns off a team to go do Alexa, like now there's a thing you can buy and they report how many they sold and you can see the price, and it's a very different kind of, so you have to really look at the whole company to understand that. But the transition, it actually turns out to be super interesting from a cultural perspective because you have to make sure you have the right people, because a lot of times if you take the people who were just focused on continuing the engine, they might not be able to think outside the box enough. But on the other hand, if you take the people who only think outside the box, you might get nothing really quick. And so you have to really know the people. And what I always thought about is you have to assemble the team to do something new. And so like you pick the Microsoft thing that you could think of, where did it come from? And I could tell you the history of like putting those people together and the phase that you went through. But it's very much like building the Justice League or the Super Friends. and you have to know the superpower of each person you're putting. Otherwise, you're just going to get too much or too little.
Steven, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you very much.